Hi, my name is Morgan Hudawanik, and my project was made on psychological realism. Psychological realism. What do you think it is? Upon first hearing the word psychological realism, what do you think it means? Well, if you break it down, psychological has to do with the mind, and realism has to do with what's actually real. So if you combine these two meanings, what do you get? In my own interpretation of this word, I think it means how we would act in the real world. For example, I myself know most people are genuinely good, but I also know people have the capacity to be bad. So I have to use my judgment or my own common sense to determine which side of the spectrum a person would fall on, based off of what I already know in the real world to be true, and act accordingly. What is it actually? According to our text, psychological realism is a theory of perception, and psychologists aim to know if participants in the experiment will act or behave in a certain way dependent on certain life experiences, which means they try to duplicate natural experiences artificially, specifically emergency situations, and they aim to determine if the reciprocating behaviors in a clinical environment prove that certain behaviors will continually happen so they can predict them in the future. There are some questions that psychologists try or need to answer in order to predict the validity of the behaviors, emotions, or anything that happens during these clinical settings, experiments. So the first question that a psychologist would have to answer is, was the simulated emergency similar to the real life emergency? Why would this be important to a psychologist? Why would we care? So, if it does not evoke a real human emotion or trigger real responses, then how can we predict how people would actually react in future emergencies? And how can we create a safety plan now to help later? So, it's actually pretty important to make sure that the realness of the experiment is pretty spot on. Question number 2. Did the participants have the same type of perceptions and thoughts? Did they make up the same type of decisions? Did they choose the same behaviors that they would have in an actual real life situation? Why is this important also? This helps to determine the validity of actions, so we can determine what we can expect in an emergency, so our law enforcement or scientists can plan accordingly for the future. This really is a helpful tool if it's used correctly, and if behaviors can be observed and not false behaviors due to faulty experiments. How to keep things authentic, which is pretty important because you want to make sure you want to be valid. You want to have validity to your experiments, and people will question most experiments, but you want to keep them authentic. So, according to our text, psychologists attempt to keep an experiment authentic or as real as possible. So, a cover story is offered up to the actual participants of an experiment. A cover story is a story given to disguise the real purpose of a study to keep emotions, behaviors, and decisions authentic. And I have provided 2 examples of psychological realism experiments in this presentation. The first one being the pandemic exercises for the World Health Organization. All right, let me center that out a little more. Did you know a team of experts at the World Health Organization, which does contain some psychologists as well as other types of healthcare professionals, who spend time analyzing how citizens, like us, in large areas or set areas, like specific areas, where pandemics could potentially hit, how we would act or respond in a real-life emergency and or pandemic. In most cases, we have not historically done very well in these areas. Case in point, the COVID-19 pandemic. As you see, 2 years later, we are still no closer to being done with this pandemic. A side note that I found pretty interesting was that the World Health Organization knew that we would never be able to handle a large scale or massive pandemic because we did not have a detailed enough plan or even the resources available to aid the world's citizens. So it was no surprise that we have handled the current pandemic so poorly. So there's a second example, which is the passerby effect. So the passerby effect has to do with when you see a person on the street in need of help, or you see any person really in need of help, and you have this feeling that when you walk by them, well, someone else will come by. Someone else has already helped this person. There's no way anyone else would have walked by this person and not helped them already. Especially nowadays, people say, oh, they had a cell phone, they could have called somebody. But sometimes there are those instances where people don't have their cell phone on them and they do need help. And sometimes people are even left to fend for themselves and die in the street because of this phenomenon. People have been observed and studied in a clinical setting in regard to this phenomenon. Psychologists have changed variables to see if it would change the outcome, but most results have remained the same. They've changed genders, ethnicities, and various other variables, but the phenomenon has remained rather constant. You could label this as a constant behavior that people sometimes leave people to fend for themselves, but you do get the handful of people like, people that are like nurses and have that general, I need to help people type of attitude and do help out because they have, the knowledge of the passerby effect, so they know they need to offer aid. So we're to our conclusion slide of the psychological realism. So, in conclusion, for psychological realism, psychological realism is the concept of how a person would act in a real world type of emergency type of situation. It looks at the emotions that we would experience during an emergency type of situation, the decisions we would make, and the behaviors. Psychologists attempt to create a super realistic situation to ensure they evoke a definite real world reaction, to determine if they can create a set list of emotions, behaviors, and decisions in order to predict how we may act in a future disaster in order to help. This is a very interesting theory to me. However, I feel like in the eyes of real chaos, with real consequences, I do not think anyone can truly know how someone would act, especially in life or death. I feel like if it was between, if there was a tsunami and you were running for cover and trying to get to high ground, whether or not, in a clinical setting, you may actually try to help someone get to higher ground, but in that situation, you may just run or even push someone out of the way because it is actually life or death. So, I'm sure clinical settings do try to do a really good job, but you cannot really evoke a real life or death situation because you don't actually have death on the line. So that's all I have to say on that. And that's the end. Thank you so much.